Good evening. Thanks so much for coming. As you may be able to tell by that introduction, I am a storyteller. And so I want to tell you a story tonight. Now, it happens to be my story, my journey to becoming a writer of Christian fiction. But my story, like all of your stories, is part of a much bigger story. When we become Christians, our stories become part of the story that God is writing, that He began writing a long time ago, and that's still being written. And so we're being written into His story. Now, good stories always start with a bang, like you want to catch the reader's attention right away. And I think God did that in His story. We start off with the big bang, creation, creating the whole universe and everything there is out of nothing. That'll grab your attention in a story right away. And then a good story always introduces the characters right away. And in God's story, we meet pretty close to the beginning. We meet the first two humans, Adam and Eve. Now, they're in paradise. And if they stayed in paradise, we wouldn't really have much of a story, would we? But things turned bad, if you know the story. Adam and Eve fall into sin and drag all of us down with them. So we call that the plot trigger. It's this change that comes about in your story where everything changes, and now you have a new goal, something you want to accomplish in the story. So for Adam and Eve and for all of us, the goal has been to try to get back into communion with God, back to what we lost in paradise when Adam and Eve walked with God and were in His presence all the time. And so that's the story that's being written. How are we going to reconnect with God? So if you're familiar with the Bible, you know there's a great deal of action. There's a lot of characters that come along the way, good ones and bad ones. And Scripture is filled with stories, isn't it? We have Jonah and Daniel and the prophets. And in the New Testament, we've got stories like the Good Samaritan and the lost sheep. There are some wonderful rescues in this story. The rescue from Egypt, the Exodus, and all the plagues. Wow, that's really an exciting story. And of course, the greatest rescue of all, which is Christ coming to rescue us from sin, to try to, what He accomplished was to bring us back into communion with God, back into a relationship with God that we had in the beginning. And now we get to be part of that story as we do our part, take our place in helping to redeem what was lost in paradise. Now, we know the ending of God's story. I'm sorry for the spoiler if you're not familiar with the ending, but God's story will end wonderfully. We're told in Revelation, the kingdoms of this world become the kingdoms of our God and of His Christ, and He shall reign forever and ever. But we're not quite there yet to that end, are we? And so in the meantime, we have to take our place and do our part in the story. Story is important to God. He gives us the Scripture. He gives us everything we need to know about Him in the form of story. And our stories are being woven into His. We're part of the action that takes place. You think of all those good kings, bad kings, Jonah, Daniel, the Hebrew children in the fiery furnace. We get to take our place in that story. No one is insignificant. Now, if you'll stick with me for just a little while, I'd like to tell you some of my stories of my life and how I see they fit into God's bigger story. And my goal is, I hope it will encourage you as you make choices in your own pilgrimage, in your own journey to find your place in God's kingdom. Now, I did not start off life to be a writer. I know there's these little kids that start making books from the time they're old enough to write. I was not one of those little kids. But I always did live in my imagination. I was very much like that little character in the cartoon Calvin and Hobbes. He's got the little stuffed tiger and he is imagining all these things. That's the way I was. I was never really where I was. If I was riding my bike, it was a horse or it might be a motorcycle, and I was always creating stories. Got me in trouble a few times, but that's another story. It's also fair to say I grew up in a library. My mother was the town librarian. It was a small town, small library. They only had one librarian, and she did everything. And so we lived in that library, and we did everything too. So stories were always part of my life, but I didn't imagine writing them. The first big choice I had to make as an adult, like all of you, you're sort of launching into adulthood, the first big choice is the choice of a college. Where you're going to go, what ideas and situations are going to form your future. And because I grew up in a Christian family, it was important to me that the spiritual side of my education was there, as well as just learning, the disciplines. And so I chose a liberal arts college in Michigan called Hope College, and it was affiliated with the Reformed Church. Now, I had no idea what a liberal arts education was. I was a psychology major. That's all I had in mind. I just wanted to study psychology. I was fascinated by human behavior, why people did the crazy things they did. And I had this vague notion that as a psychologist, I would be able to help people sort out their life and help to make choices. And so that was my goal. And when I got here got to Hope, to this liberal arts college, I found out that I had to have a broad spectrum of classes. And I had to take science courses and history courses, philosophy courses. We had Old Testament, New Testament. We had to take a foreign language. I took Spanish. And I had to take a required music course. And I just couldn't see the value in all of this. I thought, I want to be a psychologist. I don't know what all these other things have to do with being a psychologist. Well, I quickly learned that at least one of those courses was very valuable for my future. I had to take a required music course, and my husband was a music major. He was my future husband, I should say. And if I hadn't had to take that music course, I probably never would have met my husband. So it wasn't until much later in life that I learned the importance of a liberal arts education and this broad introduction to new ideas and new disciplines. Now, also at Hope College, we had required chapel. We had to go 4 out of the 5 weekdays to chapel. And it was in one of these chapel services that I had my first deep experience with God. Like I say, I grew up in a Christian family. But there's a saying that goes, God doesn't have any grandchildren. That just because your parents are Christians doesn't mean you're a Christian. That we're all children of God, not grandchildren of God. And so we each have to come to salvation and to a relationship with God on our own, separate from our parents. So it was in one of these chapel services at Hope College that they sang a hymn that was unfamiliar to me. I hadn't grown up with it. It's called Be Thou My Vision. And it's a prayer, in a way, to God, asking Him to guide you through your life, to be the vision set before you for your life. And it was while I was singing the words to this song that I felt God's presence in a very real, tangible way for the first time in my life. If you've ever had that experience of feeling that closeness of God, feeling His love, it's almost like you can't breathe. It's so beautiful, so fleeting. But God was very real. As I sang the words to this song, asking God to be my vision, Thou my true Father, and I thy true Son, Thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. And I prayed that as a prayer, telling God I wanted to serve Him. I wanted to walk with Him in relationship all my life. Now, I had no idea how that was going to come about. I kind of had a vague notion that He might call me to some jungle missionary place, and I wasn't too happy about that because I don't do jungles and snakes and spiders and all those things. But I said yes to God anyway. And started walking with him and wondering where on earth this was going to take me. I married my husband, the musician who got me through the music class, and right after we got married, he won a scholarship to Yale University School of Music. So we went off there. And the way God works, at least I've found that he works, he calls you, you go into relationship with him, but he doesn't tell you what you're up in for right away. But the next thing that kind of happens are experiences. And all these things, and at the time, you have no idea how all these experiences in your life are all going to fit together. But trust me, they do. And you'll someday look at it and you'll see how it all fits together. So one of my first experiences after we got married, and he's in graduate school, I worked for the Dean of Students at Yale as a secretary, Dean of the Yale College undergraduates. Now that sounds very fancy, but I was basically a secretary, and I typed his letters all day and answered his phone. But again, here's this experience. I didn't know I was becoming quite good at typing, and that was going to play a big part in my future as a writer, that I'd get really good at typing. But also the drama in the dean's office and with the students and their ups and downs and everything, and just watching all of that. I was fascinated with human behavior to begin with, and here I was right in the middle of it all. Now, when my husband graduated from Yale, he went to New York City and took an audition. He likes to play in symphony orchestras. And he won a job in the National Symphony Orchestra of Bogota, Colombia. And he came home from the audition. He was so excited. He's going to be principal trumpet in this major world orchestra. And I said, I'm so happy for you. Have a very nice life. Send me a postcard. And I don't do jungles and snakes and all that stuff. But he reminded me that in my marriage vows, I said for better or for worse. And so off we went to Bogota, Colombia. And again, it was God introducing me again to another experience. I also found out why I needed a foreign language in college, because I had studied Spanish, and here I was in a Spanish-speaking country. So that worked out very well. But if you ever have a chance to travel abroad, to go to another country and immerse yourself in another culture, it's so eye-opening. It's so worth it. And you meet people from a different culture that you grew up with. I can't even express how important I think it is to just get that viewpoint. Maybe it's on a mission trip or something, but it puts your life in a totally different perspective. And so again, God was immersing me in all these new ideas and new people and new culture. Now, I didn't have a lot to do down there when he was off rehearsing and playing concerts all the time. So I got a job at a school. It was my first teaching job ever, right out of college. And it was an all-boys Catholic school that went from kindergarten to grade 12. And the idea was these were Spanish-speaking Colombian boys, but that I was educating them in English. It was like English immersion. So I taught fourth grade. I taught all the subjects, science, reading, math, in English, but they spoke Spanish. And parent-teachers conferences were a good challenge, using my college Spanish. But again, being introduced to new ideas. Now, I had 36 boys in my class. Can you imagine? My first teaching job. Now, the other thing down in Colombia was, if you went to a movie, we didn't have a television. Everything's in Spanish, right? So I didn't have a lot to do. You went to a bookstore. The books were all in Spanish. So I asked my sister to send me some books. And she had been an English major, a literature major in college. And she had all these great works of English literature that I would have been reading had I been an English major instead of a psychology major. And so I'm just immersing myself in all the great classics of literature, American literature, world literature. Later on, when I started actually trying to learn how to write, I was told, before you try to write, you should read at least 100 books. And there we go. I had already read my 100 books down in Colombia. Now, one of the books that she sent me had a life-changing impression on me. It was a book called The Hiding Place by a Dutch author, Corrie ten Boom. Now, if you're not familiar with this book, I highly recommend you get it. Corrie ten Boom and her father and her sister lived in a town in the Netherlands. They were very devout Christians. They were the kind that not just loved God and worshiped Him, but they served Him any way they could. And when World War II started, the Netherlands was neutral. They had been neutral in World War I, and they intended to be neutral in World War II. But the Nazis invaded them and bombed their city of Rotterdam, and it was a surprise to the Dutch people, and they were, within 3 days, they had to surrender because the Dutch army just couldn't compete against the Nazis. And so this very devout Dutch family find themselves under the finger of the Nazis. And when they found out what the Nazis were doing to the Jewish people, they knew they had to help. And so they risked their lives saving Jews from the Holocaust in the Netherlands. Now they got caught. Somebody informed on them what they were doing, and they got arrested. And Corrie and her father and her sister ended up in a concentration camp, and Corrie was the only one who survived. And when I read this book, I was young, and I knew that if I had been in her situation, this surprise invasion, I knew my faith was not strong enough to stand up against what they put up with, much less risk my life in the way that they had risked their lives. But I knew I wanted that kind of faith. And so that book had a profound change on me, and I really wanted to start digging in and really reading the Bible. I found one of these little schedules that if you read certain chapters every day faithfully, that in the course of a year you've read through the whole Bible. And so I committed to doing that and reading the Bible and to prayer and to studying books by other Christian authors like Eugene Peterson, and just strengthening my faith, prayer life, having a daily devotional, a daily quiet time. And her story influenced my story. And that's the other neat thing about all our stories, is they're connected and we affect one another's stories. So while we were in Colombia also, we decided to start a family. And so our oldest son, Joshua, was born down in Colombia. When we returned to the United States, it was our plan to start a family and have our children 2 years apart. But Joshua turned 2 years, and then he turned 3 years, and then he turned 4 years, and we're not having any more children. And I really wrestled with God in prayer. Why isn't He answering my prayer? Joshua turns 5. Joshua turns 6. Why isn't God answering my prayer? And that's where the second book that had a profound influence on my life comes in. It was a novel, not nonfiction, but fiction, called The Chosen by a Jewish author, Chaim Potok. And when I read his story, it did two things. First of all, he's a Jewish author, and he takes us into the world of Orthodox Jews in New York City, the real strict Jewish people, where, this is a whole world normally we wouldn't know anything about. But he takes us there, and he makes it familiar to us. And in the course of the story, prayer is important, devotion to God is important. The way God is working behind the scenes is part of the story. Now, it wasn't the author's intent to do this to convert us to Judaism. It's just that was his worldview, and so that became part of the story. And I thought, why can't there be stories like that from a Christian worldview, where you're not necessarily trying to preach, you're just trying to show people of faith in everyday life, going about their business, doing what they're doing, with God at work in the background, and God part of their story. So that was the first way it influenced me. It made me long for Christian worldview, fiction from a Christian worldview. The second impact it had on me is that in the course of the plot of the story, it showed me one of the reasons why a loving Father like God might relate to his son and not give the son everything he's asking for, not answer all his prayers, so to speak. And a little light went on in my head, and God had spoken to me through this fiction on a possible reason why he wasn't answering my prayers the way I wanted him to. And in that moment, I saw the power of fiction, that God can use fiction to speak to us and to speak to our hearts in ways that maybe a minister standing up and preaching might not be able to accomplish. Well, after this, my husband won a job in a symphony orchestra in Canada, and we moved to Canada. And after 7 long years of waiting for a family, our second son was born, and you'll be happy to know that he's now a professor here at the college. So that worked out very well. And 2 years after he was born, our daughter was born. Now here we are in Canada. It's 40 below zero, and that's on a good day, and that's not counting the wind chill. And the snow is up to here, and I spend a lot of time reading books along with raising these kids. And I began to be disappointed in so many books that I read. They might be beautifully written, but there's no hope. It's as if the worldview of the author is, life is hard and then you die. And that's all there is. I agree that life is hard, but God is good. And I remembered how this author, Chaim Potok, had woven in a Jewish worldview. And I sat down one day and thought, I want to write books from a Christian worldview. I want to write books that offer hope. I had no idea if I could do this or not. But I sat down one day when my children were napping, and I started to write. And within a very short period of time, I discovered that I loved it. And I discovered that I was sort of wired to like to write. I didn't mind sitting by myself for long periods of time and making up stories. I loved the power of making up stories. I get to decide, you're happy, you're sad, you live, you die. It was great, great control. Loved it. And I also found out in that moment that all these experiences that God had been giving me over the years, my liberal arts classes with this breadth of information and ideas, my experiences at Yale, my experiences in Columbia, even all those years of wrestling with God, all the books I read, God was building this foundation that was going to be built upon when I finally found what he was calling me to do. So don't discount all those experiences that you have in life. You never know how they're going to come back. And now God even had me in the perfect place. Here I am in Winterpeg, otherwise known as Winnipeg, Manitoba, and the cold, and you can't go anywhere. What else can you do but write? No experience is ever wasted. The good, the bad, God is always at work. Author Melody Beatty writes this, "Our past is neither an accident nor a mistake. We have been where we needed to be with the necessary people. We can embrace our history with its pain, its imperfection, its mistakes, even its tragedies. It was intended just for us." Now, when I first started to write, I didn't know if I was going to be a success. I didn't even know if I could write. So I had a lot of fear. If you tell somebody you're a writer, like 2 weeks later, they say, "Hey, did you finish the book you're working on? Or did you get your book published yet?" And I was a little embarrassed. I didn't want to admit to anybody what I was doing as a writer because I was afraid I would fail. And after a while, I started to realize that if I really felt this is where God was calling me, and I did, that I had to have the courage to call myself a writer, even if there was no other evidence except the fact that I'm typing every day, no sign of success as a writer. I had to have the courage to call myself a writer. And this was a choice, an important choice in my life that I had to make. And so I sort of say, okay, God, I guess I'll do this. Before I even had a chance to announce it to the world, on a Saturday morning one time, my husband was giving music lessons, and he'd have students come in and out all day taking their music lessons, and off they'd go. And I had set up the typewriter in the middle of the living room, and the kids are playing all around me, and I'm working on my book. And one of his students wandered in. He was waiting for his turn. I didn't know the kid at all. Wandered in, waiting for his turn, and he says, "Hi, what you doing?" And I thought, all right, am I going to tell him what I'm doing? He's going to laugh or what? But I thought, no, I'm going to be brave. And so I said, well, I'm writing a book. I'm a writer. And he gets a big smile on his face, and he says, "Oh, that's really cool." He says, "My mom is a writer. You should meet her sometime." And of course, I asked, "Your mom's a writer. What does she write?" And he says, well, he got a little bit shy, and he said, "We're Christians, and she writes devotional books for a Christian publishing company down in the States called Moody Press in Chicago." I was very surprised, and I was even more surprised the next week when he came for his lesson. His mother came with him. And she turned out to be one of these people that loves to encourage other people, especially other writers. And she took me under her wing, and she began to teach me everything I needed to know about getting published, about writing, all this stuff that I never learned in school. And she invited me to a writer's critique group. And I often wonder where I would be today if I'd even be a writer, if I hadn't had the courage to tell that young man that I was a writer. Now, when you figure we were living in a city of 700,000 people, and God brings to our door probably one of the very few published Christian authors in that city, I have to call that a miracle. That's the way God works. He brings miracles into our life when we step out in faith. Now, the book I was writing, the book I first started writing, it's entitled now Gods and Kings. And what I did was I took a story from the Old Testament about King Hezekiah, and I fictionalized his life. Because I found out when I read the Bible, it's 3D for me. I see it in color, I see the soldiers, I hear the sounds, and I found out not everybody reads the Bible like that. That some people think it's kind of boring, and they go, oh, good king, bad king, good king, bad king. But to me, it's 3D, and I thought, if I could somehow bring that story to life and let other people read about these Bible people the way I see them, that they are ordinary people. They have the same ups and downs as we do. They don't walk around with some little special halo on their head. And so it was my goal to bring the story of King Hezekiah to life. And I thought, if this story can help just one person, the way that Chaim Potok's book influenced me, then it would be worth all the hours at the computer, at the typewriter. Now, when I first started writing the book, you have to open with a bang, right? You have to open with a very exciting beginning. And so King Hezekiah's father, King Ahaz, was one of the bad kings, and he sacrificed his children to Moloch in the fire. So I opened the book where Hezekiah is just a little boy. He wakes up in the middle of the night, and there's all this activity going on. He hears soldiers marching and people shouting and doors slamming, and he's wondering what's going on. And so an early version of this opening chapter, I gave it to my husband to read, and I'm waiting for him to tell me, this is great, the next bestseller right here. He didn't do that. Instead, he said, "You have doors slamming. Did they have doors in 700 BC? I said, I don't know, but I knew I had to find out. I had to be authentic. So I knew I had some research to do. And one of the resources I used was a magazine called Biblical Archaeology Review, and they talk about all the archaeological discoveries in the Holy Land that coordinate with the Bible. And also in these issues, it has volunteer opportunities to go on an archaeological dig. Well, that sounded like the perfect way to do research. By the way, that's one of the great things about writing. You get to travel and see some really interesting places. So I decided I would really like to go on this. It was a study program. You go on an archaeological dig, you study biblical backgrounds through a seminary in Texas, and you live in Israel for a month on this dig. Husband's all for it. I mean, after all, he dragged me to Colombia and to Canada, so he kind of owed me a trip to Israel. So, of course, we didn't have any money. So the only way to earn money is to babysit. So I had my 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and I found another family that needed a babysitter, and they had 3 boys. So now I'm stuck in the basement in Canada at 40 below with 6 children. And that's where the 36 boys in my class in Columbia. Suddenly, 6 wasn't so bad after I had dealt with 36. No experience is ever wasted. So I worked for a whole year babysitting these darling children and earned enough money to go on the dig. And my husband was all supportive. You go, I'll take care of the kids. Don't worry about a thing. And about a week or so before I was ready to go on the dig, one of my children, who shall remain nameless, came home from school with chickenpox. And a few hours later, child number 2 came down with chickenpox. And not too long later, child number 3 had chickenpox. And that's when we discovered that my husband had never had chickenpox. And he was very sick, very sick. And I called up the seminary, I called the airlines. I'm trying to, delay leaving. And the bottom line, basically, everywhere I called was, you'll lose all your money. If you don't go now, the plane trip is non-refundable. The whole thing is non-refundable. You'd lose it all. And my husband from his deathbed is like, go, you need to go, I'll be fine. And then somebody helpful from the church called up and said, I think God is telling you that you need to forget about being a writer and that your family must come first and that you should not go on this trip. And I really wanted to know, is that really what God is telling me? And I had to make a choice. And I prayed so hard, and I said, God, should I go? Should I not go? And remember how, after reading Corrie ten Boom's book, I began to read the Bible faithfully every day. As I'm praying and asking God to show me what to do, the daily reading for that day was Psalm 48, which says in part, walk around Jerusalem, count her towers, consider well her ramparts, view her citadels, that you may tell of them to the next generation. For this God is our God forever and ever. He will be our guide even to the end. So I felt God was telling me to go. And then to confirm my decision, some very good friends from church called up and they said, you need to go. We'll take care of your family. Don't worry about them. They'll be fine. So I went to Israel, and I went on the archaeological dig, and they have doors in 700 BC, and if you read the opening chapter, they will be slamming. So time goes on. I finished the manuscript, and then it came time to begin submitting to publishers. And we didn't have literary agencies in those days. You had to do everything yourself. And you were only supposed to send it to one publisher at a time. You'd send the proposal and some sample chapters, and you'd get it back, and you'd send it again, and you'd get it back. And this went on for a while. It gets discouraging after a while. And finally, one publisher down in the United States said, we're interested in your manuscript. Send the whole manuscript. So back then, they had the dot matrix printers, and you had to print it all up. Remember, you had to tear all the little, you're probably too young, you don't remember that. But anyway, you print up the whole thing, put it in a box, mailed it down to the United States, and then I waited. And I waited some more, and I waited some more. And it would go through all these committees, and it took almost a year, and finally they said, it's got one more committee to go, and then you should be hearing any day about your book. So I'm waiting at home. I'm not going anywhere. This may fascinate you younger people, but back in those days, the phones were hooked to the house. You couldn't go anywhere. If you were expecting a phone call, you had to wait at home by this phone that's hooked to the wires to the house. So I'm waiting and for the phone to ring and start my career as a writer. And instead, the doorbell rang. And when I went to the door, it was our mail carrier, and he had a big black plastic garbage bag with my name and address taped on it. And my first thought was, I guess I don't have enough garbage. Somebody is sending me some more. But when I opened the garbage bag, there was my manuscript, all the pages. Some had tire prints on them, some had footprints on them, and in the bottom of the bag was the box that I had mailed it in, and it had burst open somewhere in a post office between the United States and Canada, and somebody had very helpfully scooped it up and put it in this garbage bag and delivered my manuscript to me that way. And down in the middle of all this mess was the letter from the publisher saying, "We're sorry, but we've decided not to publish your book." One of the most discouraging moments in my life. It's bad enough to be rejected, but to have your manuscript in a garbage bag, it just seemed like it was a short trip out to the actual trash barrel, and that would be the end of my writing career. And so without praying about it, I was so discouraged, I signed up a teaching contract for the next year. I figured even if I printed out another one and started this whole process again, it could take a year, but I just didn't feel much like writing. If you want to know what happens to somebody when they go in a different direction from the direction that God is calling them, read the book of Jonah, and you'll find out what happens. And that's what happened to me. I was walking away from my calling as a writer and going in a wrong direction, and God wanted me back to writing. And that teaching job was the most stressful job I ever had in my life. 3 different times I was in the doctor's office with 3 different ailments, and every time he said, "It's stress-related. Are you under stress?" And oh boy, was I under stress. Because I was in the belly of the whale. I was not where God wanted me to be. Sometimes the hard places that we find ourselves in are actually God's grace, because He's calling us to a different path. And I had to decide, was I going to return to writing, even though this terrible disappointment, or was I going to keep going in the wrong direction and quit? Well, I decided not to quit. Actually, it was much easier to just write than it was to try to deal with the students in the classroom. Around this time, we moved from Canada back to the United States, and I started writing seriously. I started sending the manuscript off, getting it back, sending it off. And finally, I found another publisher who said, "Send us the whole thing." And once again, it was a whole year of waiting for the final answer. And this time, I wasn't staying at home by the phone because I knew what could happen, like last time. And it happened to be summer vacation, and the kids were home, and I was out getting groceries when the publisher called and said to the kids, "Tell your mommy we're going to publish her manuscript." Well, they were so excited, they went to my neighbor and said, "Do you know the phone number of the grocery store? We want to call Mom and tell her her book's published." Fortunately, my neighbor knew me well enough to know if I heard my name over the loudspeaker, I'd be imagining ambulances and fire trucks and everything. So while the kids were waiting for me to come home, they decided to decorate the house. And they made one of those computer banners with the dot matrix printer, "Congratulations, Mom." And they had posters they put up, drawing. But the funniest thing was they remembered when I was in high school, I was a Beatles fan. And so they had the music all cued to the Beatles song, "I Want to Be a Paperback Writer." And I came home and they were telling me, that you're going to publish your book. And I've been writing ever since. If you keep saying yes to God, you keep following in the direction on your journey, He's leading somewhere. If we say yes to God, He's leading us. Now, where is He leading us? One of my favorite verses is 2 Corinthians 2:9, and it goes like this: "No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love Him." I could never have imagined the career I have now. It's an international writing and speaking career. My books are published in 12 languages, and I'm not only influencing people here, but people in other countries, like Germany and Switzerland and the Netherlands, Denmark, Romania, Korea. I could not have imagined that. Only God can do that if we let Him use our experiences, if we say yes to God. This is where we're headed. Now, a few years ago, I'm getting up in years, I'm getting got discouraged once again because there were so many changes in publishing. You had ebooks, the social media became so important, and I had to learn new technology, which I'm an old dog, I don't like new tricks. And I began to think, well, maybe it's time I should retire. Maybe my time is up, my purpose is up. And so again, I started praying and asking God to show me, is it time to retire? Now, when you ask God questions like this, don't you wish he'd send you a letter in the mail or maybe an email saying yes or no, very clearly? Well, for once in my life, I did get a letter from God in the mail. It was forwarded to me by my publishing company, and the return address was from a prison. And I'd like to read you the letter that I got. It starts on the top with a quote. It says, quote from Until We Reach Home by Lynn Austin, page 300. Quote, by trying to end my life, I was saying that I knew more about the future than God did. I was taking my life into my own hands when sovereignty over my life and death belongs to him. Unquote. To whom it may concern, these are the words I read this very early morning that I shall never forget until the day I die. The words reached one of the darkest places in the country where very little light is seen, jail. And I learned that she's a 22-year-old college student, just weeks away from graduating. She had a part-time job in a bank as a drive-by teller, and her boyfriend talked her into helping him rob the bank. And they got caught, and now she's facing 40 years in prison. Her letter goes on to say, I cannot state what the intent of the author, Lynn Austin, was when writing this book, but if her goal was to reach at least one person, changing their life, she succeeded. These words will forever be on my mind, especially during the darkest days of my young life, and shared with others when they have seen better days. I have addressed this letter to the publisher in hopes that it will be delivered to the right person. The right person is anyone who has a doubt that their work is meaningful. I one day wish to make the world a better place, one person at a time. Thank you for influencing my life with much gratitude. And she signed her name. I think God was telling me not to retire. Our stories become part of God's story. What we do, how we live, the choices we make, they all matter. What if I had stopped writing when my book came back in a garbage bag? God, in his goodness, uses every job, every experience, good and bad, to lead us where he wants to take us. Nothing is ever wasted. So that you can trust that every place you go, every choice you make, God is shaping your life and leading you to become part of his story. And that's the greatest purpose any of us can ever have, to be part of God's story. So keep journeying on your pilgrimage. Keep saying yes to God, and you'll be amazed at where he'll take you. Thank you.
Hi. My question is for aspiring writers, possibly at the school. What is your advice to them?
A writer isn't somebody who's published. A writer is someone who writes. So if you're an aspiring writer, I would say write every day. Make it a discipline. I mentioned my husband is a musician. Every day he practices. Every day. Even though he's a maestro now. You'd think he wouldn't need to practice. Every day. Think of writing as doing your scales if you want to be a pianist. Write free things. Write for your church newsletter. Write in a journal. Just keep writing. And that's your scales. Don't worry about publication. Because like I say, publication isn't the benchmark for being a writer. You don't know what a blog you might write might change somebody's life. So use your talents and skills, develop them, write, and keep writing, and then put it in God's hands. See what he's going to do with it and where it's going to go.
I've got a quick question. So I would imagine that writing gets easier, right? But I'm curious as to if there's anything that's gotten more difficult for you.
Actually, in a way, it's easier. It's like if you're going to drive a car. When you first start off driving a car, you have to think about everything, the blinkers and the windshield wipers. And eventually, if you drive and you get experience, all that stuff comes naturally. So in that sense, you don't have to think about all the elements of writing like constantly. It becomes second nature. But it comes harder in a way because, like now, after 30 books, I felt like I've said it all. And I'll think of a story line like, I don't know, divorce or something. Well, I did that already in this book. And, it's getting harder and harder for me to find time periods or stories that I can feel as passionate about as I did in the beginning with poor Hezekiah. And and so in that sense, it's harder. I have to dig a little bit deeper for the stories and I don't want to keep writing the same book over and over. There's some authors, they get known for a certain genre, you think of John Grisham or Stephen King, they're known for a certain style of writing. And I never wanted to just keep writing the same book over and over and over. I wanted to always stretch myself and try new things. So in that sense, it's harder.
There's time for a couple more. Another writer.
I have a question just about what is your process? Do you just write, or do you outline? Do you write character bios and then write an outline? What is your process overall?
My overall process? I start with the research, and that gives me ideas like all the possibilities that could happen in that time period. And usually while I'm researching, my characters will start coming to life, and they'll start talking to me. I know how that sounds because I was a psychology major. But when my characters I start imagining them, then I know it's time. And I do write resumes for all my characters so that I know them inside and out. They become real people to me. But then I put them in the situation and watch what happens. I don't plot it all out ahead of time. It's more fun for me that way, and I figure if I'm surprised, then the readers will be surprised. But it gets a little scary sometimes, too, because I don't know what's going to happen. And some days it's like, okay, now what? And usually that means I have to go back into researching. But I write every day. I have my quiet time first and pray, and then I start writing. My husband will tell me there's breaks for procrastination. But what I try to do every day is to write 5 pages, because I figured out if I write 5 pages a day, I can write a book in a year. And so some days I get my 5 pages done by noon. Some days I have to go back after supper and keep writing till 10 o'clock till I get my 5 pages. And then typically I'll start each morning by going back and reading what I wrote a couple days before. And I find out those 5 pages are all garbage and I have to throw them out and start all over again. But so I do a lot more rewriting than I do writing. A lot more.
So first of all, thank you for coming and speaking tonight. My question is, have you ever written a book with someone? And if so, if you have any advice on that front, but if so, how have you managed doing a project with someone or, in conjunction with another writer as like a advisor or something? Have you ever done a project like that?
No.
Would you ever recommend it?
Yeah, I know other authors who've done it, and they've got all sorts of different ways they do, like they write chapters, or one will take one character and one will take another character, or they'll collaborate. I know authors who do it very successfully, so I know it can be done. I'm just too stubborn and independent I don't even like the editors fixing anything. So.
Hey, usually, so I'm a philosophy major, and usually when I ask our English professor one of these types of questions, she just kind of says yes. So my question is structure, when you go about creating a structure, do you think the process is somewhat more organic, or would you say it's something more logical? Some background is my grandpa was a lawyer, he was a judge, and whenever he's talking to my dad, whenever we're talking about stuff like that, he's very adamant about the structure and the organization of a given thing. And with philosophy papers, that's kind of like how you make the whole dang thing is it's got to have some logical structure and kind of go from A to B. But what I enjoy the most about watching movies and reading books is how they structure the narrative and how it flows. And I've read papers from other people that write very differently than me, and it's sometimes very chaotic, but still makes an interesting point. It is fun to read. And so do you think that it's kind of like an either or what kind of relationship goes there in the structure and organization of developing writing and maybe as it relates specifically to storytelling?
I would say there are rules, and what makes a good story. You really need a beginning and a middle and an end. If you've ever read a book that sort of drifts off into the end and you think, well, I'll never get that time spent reading that book back again, it's really a waste of time. I think the best books know the structure, know the rules, but then find creative ways to work within that structure. Because, there are some books, you read the first chapter, you know exactly what's they're so structured in that it's such a, cliche almost, that you read the first chapter, you know what's going to happen. And that's what I would say is too much structure. There's certain elements of writing that people enjoy, like setting and plot and characters and point of view. You have to know those rules, then you can break them in creative ways. But if you figure the whole idea of a story is to communicate, and if you drift so far from the structure that people are going, huh? What? Then you're not communicating, you're not telling that story. So I think it's a balance of both. To know the rules, to know the structure, to be aware of it and to be aware of readers' expectations, but find a creative way in the middle of that to express yourself. So you're not sounding like just every other writer, that your personality comes through, your individuality, your voice.
We have time for one last question, and it will be from Oliver.
As an author, which of your books do you think somebody would best read first?
First? Well, you could start with the one I started with, Hezekiah, Gods and Kings. My books tend to have female protagonists, except for Hezekiah, of course. And they're all different time periods. So that's biblical history, but then I've got like Civil War, I've got World War II, I've got the Great Depression, I've got, just close your eyes and point. I don't know what to tell you.
Thank you so much for your